Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Aranda. I'm a professor of sociology and the director of the Immigrant Well-Being Research Center at the University of South Florida. I'm also co-founder and co-director of the Immigrant Well-Being Scholar Collaborative, and in that capacity, I'm honored to welcome you to today's event, At the Border and Beyond, Research-Informed Approaches to Advance Immigrant Well-Being. The Immigrant Well-Being Scholar Collaborative, or the Collaborative for short, is a network of academic researchers, centers, and institutes working together to translate empirical findings on the lived experiences of immigrants and their communities for impact in the policymaking world. Promoting well-being, including the social, emotional, economic, and physical well-being of individuals and communities, is enshrined in the work of core institutions like the CDC, the NIH, and the UN. We choose to center research on the well-being of immigrants because we believe that when policies are informed by the realities facing our most vulnerable community members, they are more effective and just for all of us. Driven by that shared mission, during today's webinar, the Collaborative's current cohort of IWB Policy Fellows will share insights from their original research and the implications for immigration enforcement practices and policies at and beyond the southern U.S. border. Spanning from qualitative narratives generated through interviews with immigrants and their families to quantitative analysis of federal court cases, all these findings are peer-reviewed and based in rigorous empirical methods. The full-length research articles from this research are forthcoming in 2 edited volumes of the academic journal American Behavioral Scientist, edited by collaborative co-director Dr. Elizabeth Vaquera and myself. While as a professor, I hope some of you will engage with these full texts, the collaborative team has prepared a series of briefs and toolkits for each of these projects that you can find on the landing page for today's webinar at iwbcollab.org/briefing. As part of our mission to uplift the voices of immigrants and their communities, these toolkits include key takeaways grounded in real experiences and quotes from real people impacted by the immigration enforcement system. However, any participants' names shared in those materials and today's presentation have been changed to protect their identities. For those of you on Zoom, we will also share links to these and related materials in the chat throughout the webinar. We also encourage you to utilize the Q&A function throughout the presentations. We have a full hour scheduled, so if we are unable to respond live today, we are happy to follow up via email or on any of your questions about the information provided. Shortly, we will be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Vaquera, who will share more about the current immigration policy landscape. But first, I would like to invite a very special guest to share a few remarks. We are delighted to be joined today by the representative for the 38th District of California, Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. Since joining the House in 2002, Representative Sanchez has been an outspoken advocate for Latinos and immigrants in her role as a member and past chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, as well as co-founder of the Congressional Labor and Working Families Caucus. Thank you so much for joining us today, Congresswoman Sanchez.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everybody who is joining this webinar. I appreciate you guys inviting me to participate. So I want to just start by saying thank you, because the work and the research that you all are conducting is really critical to informing me and my colleagues in terms of how we approach immigration policy. It's been incredibly difficult to combat and dispel some of the really harmful narratives that have been circulating about immigrants and migrants, particularly the ongoing drumbeat that they're related to drug trafficking and illicit fentanyl. These are really harmful narratives, and they've directly contributed to the growing anti-immigrant sentiment that unfortunately we see spreading throughout the country. Not that long ago, a majority of Americans, I think it was somewhere around 76%, said that they favored some kind of immigration reform, but that number sadly has been dropping. We are living in a time where, migrants and immigrants are vilified, particularly by the Republican Party. And, this is a party that currently controls the House of Representatives. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, we are at a complete standstill, not just on immigration reform, but on anything in Congress. Republicans have just made immigration reform impossible, but they've not even been able to fulfill the basic functions of our government. So we are having, problems just doing simple things like keeping the lights on in the federal government. Every 6 weeks or so, we are faced with another possible government shutdown because there is so much in-party fighting amongst themselves that they can't even do the business that they're elected to do, which is to run the federal government. Sadly, over the past 30 to 35 years, we have seen only enforcement-only legislation come through Congress. Now, I've served in Congress my 22nd year. As long as I've been in Congress, I have been an advocate and pushing for comprehensive immigration reform. And every so often, when we think that we may get an immigration bill, Republicans are successful at blocking it. And what they do instead is they pass this enforcement only legislation, which sets us further back. It just, it exacerbates the problem instead of overhauling our immigration system, which I think is one of the reasons why your research is so critical. We need to continue to show that just pouring more money into enforcement only strategies like militarizing our existing, 100-mile border barrier is only going to exacerbate the problems that we're seeing at the border today. Without additional relief and pathways to citizenship, those bottlenecks are just going to continue to grow. And we've seen that with TSP recipients via executive order, when the administration grants TSP for certain groups of migrants, we see the number of migrants from those communities drop tremendously at the border. What they're looking for is a legal pathway. So we need to provide those pathways if we're going to reduce some of the numbers that we see at the border. Right now, we are sadly seeing some of the most inhumane border policies that I've ever seen in our nation. In Texas, we saw that Governor Abbott installed razor wire and anchor buoys attached with webbings to the bottom of the Rio Grande. And in Congress, House Republicans are still dead set on passing very inhumane Trump-era immigration policies, and they're dead set on pursuing that agenda. And what those proposals do is only vilify the millions of undocumented people and immigrants who live in this country, who work and pay taxes, many of whom are constituents in my district. These are people who contribute to our economy every single day. So I continue to work with my like-minded colleagues to ensure that Republicans and even our own president don't pass any sort of, critical foreign aid bill and do it on the backs of immigrants. So your research, again, is a critical piece to me and to my staff's work on Capitol Hill. And I really look forward to hearing about the insights that you all have to share today. Again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Congresswoman Sanchez. And actually, I'm so glad and with despair, of course, because of the topics that we are addressing here, that, you brought light to this conversation and emphasize how this is a decades-long issue and how much more work there is to do to humanize the lives of immigrants and to bring them into research and using research to disprove much of this negative rhetoric that we hear well too often right now. So thank you for your words, and we'll continue to provide research that humanizes immigrants and represents the reality of what immigrant lives in our communities look like. Thank you again for being here. I am Dr. Elizabeth Vaquera. As my colleague Dr. Aranda said earlier, I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Immigrant Well-Being Research Collaborative. And I am also the executive director of the Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute and a professor of sociology and immigration policy here at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. As Representative Sanchez was saying, most of us in this forum are probably very familiar with the recent and proposed legislation that is affecting both the national and the key state-based immigration policies. So as she was presenting to all of us, this is not just a federal, but also a state level issue that we are facing. We keep seeing senators use supplemental and government funding bill negotiations as opportunities to propose restrictive and harmful asylum and border policies. As she was mentioning, these attempts to build more walls and expel or block asylees' rightful claim to seek protections in our country, they are rehashing the same proposals that we've seen in the House last year with the Secure the Border Act of 2023. It won't be news to anyone in here, and as Congresswoman Linda Sanchez was saying, Texas actually recently passed SB 4, which is set to go into effect just in a few days on March 5th, pending judicial review. If implemented, SB 4 will further criminalize unauthorized border crossings and transfer the federal power of deportation to state judges. SB 4 would also allow Texas law enforcement to arrest anyone they even suspect of entering the country without authorization, effectively, as research has demonstrated time and again, targeting Black and Brown communities. Unfortunately, these aggressive and inhumane policies responses, as we were discussing, are not new. They are decades long. They come actually from the origin of the immigration in our country and before, and are in fact just another example of the prevention through deterrence strategy that has defined the U.S. border enforcement since the 90s, as we're saying. Over the past 3 decades, we have witnessed huge and unprecedented escalations in border enforcement infrastructure, including expanding the border wall, as we're saying, deploying advanced surveillance technology, increasing patrol agents, and a significant increase in the use of detention. The toll of these practices is enormous, with over 7,500 border crossing deaths between 1998 and 2021 at the southwest border. And CBP is expected to report shortly almost 900 deaths in 2023 alone, including almost 200 in Arizona. This practice is not relegated, however, to a single political party. While my own research with Dr. Aranda has examined the negative consequences of anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies during the Trump administration, the current administration has also doubled down with the slogans like "do not come," and according to the New York Times this week, the White House is also considering an executive order that would append long-time guarantees that anyone who steps onto the U.S. soil has the right to seek asylum. Today's webinar is titled, as we said, "At the Border and Beyond," because the researchers that are going to be presenting next focus on how these effects are felt at the point of crossing the border and in border towns, where walls literally loom over daily life, while also recognizing that our immigration enforcement regime means that they are felt well beyond that physical space and have ripple effects over time and across communities. One of the most salient ways in which this impact extends from and beyond the border is through the 100-mile border that Congresswoman Sanchez just mentioned, and which spans customs and border protections indiscriminate authority 100 miles into the interior of the country. This zone encompasses major cities from Los Angeles to Chicago to Boston. In fact, we know that nearly 2 out of 3 people, regardless of citizenship status in the United States, live within this zone. At southwest border points in regions including like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California, CBP interacts with over 27 million citizens each year. The reality of this expanded authority informs the research of our first presentation, the impact of the 100-mile border enforcement zone on Mexican Americans in Arizona, from Drs. Nilda Flores-Gonzalez and Emir Estrada, who are both professors of sociology at Arizona State. In this research, which draws from their larger project on youth identity, Dr. Flores-Gonzalez and Dr. Estrada explored the implications of constantly experiencing border enforcement on Latino citizenship youth. Dr. Estrada will be presenting next.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vaquera, and all of you joining us remotely. I want to also extend a special thank you to Congresswoman Linda Sanchez for joining us in this important conversation. It is truly an honor to have the opportunity to share our research with an audience that cares about these social issues as deeply as we do. My name is Dr. Emira Estrada, and I am a professor of sociology in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University. And I will be presenting on behalf of our larger team that includes graduate students, undergraduate students, and our co-PIs, including Dr. Nilda Flores Gonzalez, Angela Gonzalez, and Nathan Martin. The findings we are sharing today comes from a larger Arizona Youth Identity Project. And through this project, funded by the National Science Foundation and Russell Sage Foundation, our team uses quantitative and qualitative methods to examine how US-born young adults in Arizona perceive their identity and status as American in a context rapidly changing economically, demographically, and politically. A critical aspect of this work was examining experiences of inclusion and exclusion and how they shape young adults' sense of security, safety, and belonging. While the larger project includes nearly 1,900 interviews with young adults of diverse backgrounds, today I will focus on findings from interviews with a subsample of Latino youth living in Arizona's 100-mile border enforcement zone. Let me provide a little bit of context and background for our study. In Arizona, the 100-mile border zone extends the indiscriminate power of Customs and Borders Protection, CBP. In this area that includes the 375-mile-long border with Mexico to the region containing roughly 40% of Arizona's population, including cities like Yuma and Tucson. In this region, there are 6 ports of entry and 12 checkpoint stations. In this area, immigration enforcement is virtually omnipresent. CBP agents are empowered to stop, interrogate, and detain individuals without a warrant or reasonable suspicion. As Dr. Vaquera mentioned, this emphasis on prevention through deterrence and the increased militarization of the border beyond the physical border has proven deadly for many trying to make the journey, but it is also deeply traumatic for those constantly haunted by its presence. Since 2020, we have met with hundreds of young adults in Arizona, and this is what they've told us. One participant that you see on the screen here, our study participant Natasha from Yuma, she's a resident from Yuma and lives near the border wall, shared with us a harrowing story of the violence in its most literal form. She told us during the interviews, and she shared an experience of a man who died while trying to cross the border. She told us, there was a dead man hanging, and you could hear the cell phone ringing from his backpack, and he was just hanging there, and nobody had done anything. I think about that every day. And I want us to really look at this quote and reflect on it. This is an experience that the youth by the border experience on a daily basis. Natasha also describes the border wall as a constant traumatic presence in her community. Importantly, the border enforcement zone in Arizona is home to a large concentration of Latinos and Native Americans. We find in the experiences shared by the participants in our study that the extension of the border enforcement from the wall to internal checkpoints heightens brown and Black citizens' risk of racial profiling, harassment, and abuse in this zone. Now, let's take a closer look at CBP detentions. Nearly 60% of the people detained by CBP are non-deportable U.S. citizens and legal residents. So again, 60% of the people detained by CBP are not deportable U.S. citizens and residents. Latinos are disproportionately represented in this group, and our participants describe routinely being selected for secondary inspections because, as one of our respondents put it to in quotation, is they simply look Mexicans. Now, what does that look like in the daily lives of these young Arizonans and their families? Let's take the case of Enrique, one of our participants. Enrique from Somerton, Arizona, shared the sentiment that we heard repeatedly from our participants. He told us, I would always get sent to secondary inspection every time, and it just seemed more of harassment. In response to this routine experience of racial profiling, Latino citizens in the region report changing their behavior and psychologically internalizing the expectations that they will always be seen as not belonging in their own communities. Again, they develop the sense of not belonging in their own communities. Others reported that their private property was damaged without any recourse during secondary inspections. Such invasive searches were justified under the official guise of searching for drugs, something that Representative Sanchez mentioned. There are official mechanisms to try to ease the navigation of these processes, such as the Sentry card. Many of you joining us might be familiar with that, with the Secured Electronic Network for Travelers Rapid Inspection Card that is issued by CBP and are meant to expedite the checkpoints of clearance processes. Yet, Latinos in the region experience the impact of racial profiling and suffer harassment even with additional documentations. For example, as you see in this quote by Frances here, referring to her experience with border checkpoints, 22-year-old Frances shared, my sister, who is a lot darker than I am, didn't have the same experience. The custom officer started asking her a bunch of questions. How did you get Sentry? Are you a US citizen? She was irritated when she shared this experience with us during the interviews, and she said, on the Sentry card, it clearly states that you have to be a US citizen to have this card. So again, they have additional layers of having to prove their belonging in their own community. Citizenship offers little protection to young people of color like Frances' sister, who are subjected to continuous surveillance and control within the 100-mile border enforcement zone. Now, the young adults articulate a diminished sense of belonging as American, which has implications for their future civic participation, mental health, and attitudes if left unaddressed. So I'm very happy to see that we have the interest from the community and local representatives to implement changes and policies that will change this. As concluding remarks, I want to share that the quotes that we shared here today are just a small selection from the experiences shared with a larger study. You can read more about our participants' experience in their own words in both the full academic article in American Behavioral Scientist and in the companion narrative toolkit, both of which are linked in this briefing website. Overall, the narratives shared by our participants show that frequent contact with immigration enforcement authorities, CBP, racially profiling, and rights violations erode a sense of security, safety, and belonging for Latino citizens living in the border zone. Now, while our study focused on Arizona border zone, research indicates that Latino citizens face similar racial profiling, harassment, and rights violations by CBP in other border states like California and Texas. The consistent reports of abuse across multiple states and the failure of programs like Sentry to protect Latino citizens from harassment suggests there are systemic issues ingrained in CBP culture and the overall immigration system, rather than being an isolated issue here in Arizona. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Estrada, and thank you to you and your team. I encourage everyone to read Dr. Flores Gonzalez and Dr. Estrada's larger work with their collaborators on the Arizona Youth Project to learn more about how these practices impact the sense of belonging and engagement of young people. Their focus on young people is especially important as we think about their individual well-being, as well as consequences for their political and economic engagement. The experiences shared of young Latinos in Arizona also feels all too relevant right now when we look to the policy examples Dr. Vaquera shared, such as Texas SB 4, and even in the state of Florida where I am, SB 1718 that passed last summer. With the failure of programs like Sentry to protect people from harassment and profiling, we know that we cannot simply try to fast pass around current enforcement policies that fundamentally target citizens of color, constantly stigmatizing them as quote-unquote un-American. When CBP does detain non-citizens without documents, they face further interactions with the immigration enforcement system defined by punitive carceral approaches. And with state measures like Texas SB4, we can only expect more people will cycle through the deportation and detention enforcement system. As Dr. Vaquera shared, this approach continues a trend of prevention through deterrence policies that entrench disparities by scapegoating migrants as potential drug smugglers or violent to justify the increased use of measures like detention. Our next presenter, Lorena Avila, who will be joining the criminology faculty at Villanova University this fall, examines trends in the immigration court system over the past 3 decades to explore how these deterrence policies and anti-immigration sentiments translate into serious limitations for non-citizens and their families in her work titled An Expensive Path to Freedom, Bond Amounts, Trajectories, and Immigration Court.
Hello, everyone. I am Lorena Avila and currently wrapping up my doctoral training at Rutgers University School of Criminal Justice and truly excited to start my path at Villanova next fall. So now we are familiar to how ICE is increasingly using civil detention as a way of holding deportable and non-deportable, apparently, migrants until they reach their court proceedings. While given another name, these detention facilities are virtually indistinguishable from prisons and are also the site of human rights abuses. In theory, the detention process is meant to first keep communities safe, and second, to ensure that non-citizens appear for their court proceedings. There is, of course, no evidence showing that immigrants are threatening their communities, and recent studies are actually showing that 98% of immigrants in removal proceedings who were released returned to court in a timely manner. So one alternative path to detention are bonds, where migrants pay a cash-based surety to help guarantee their continued engagement in the proceedings to come. But eligibility is very restrictive. Those with serious criminal records or those considered arriving subjects, such as asylum seekers, cannot opt for bond proceedings. Additionally, there is no secure legal representation for detained immigrants to support them in those hearings. So this project specifically examines what monetary bonds are telling us about the immigration detention system in a context of rigid legal scrutiny without many procedural guarantees. My co-author, and David Ibanez, who is in the Political Science Department also at Rutgers University, and I analyzed the Executive Office of Immigration Review case data published by the Department of Justice between 1991 and 2020. So this includes data from roughly 489,000 cases where bond was granted. Of those cases, 89% did not have criminal record, which is different from the migration-related infraction, and 81% had legal representation, which is atypical for average immigration proceedings, as I just mentioned. We use this data to assess the effect of legal representation and criminal records on the likelihood of securing cheaper bonds. I will share some of our larger findings today, but for those interested in the specific methodology or the more detailed trends we found, you can find a full article on the briefing webpage. We found that between 1991 and 2020, there was a 63% increase in the average bond amount set for immigration cases. Adjusted for inflation, the average bond increased from $5,000 in the 90s to an average bond of $8,200 during the 2010s. And this is well above the minimum bond for non-citizen cases, which is set at $1,500. Importantly, this steady increase occurs even when we filter for criminal history. We can see in the data that throughout the 90s, there was actually a downward trend in the average bond amount set, but we see a significant shift occurring right around 2001 that contributes to the overall trend. In many ways, this shift is the result of previously set legislation, especially the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, and perhaps most notably, the Homeland Security Act of 2002 following the attacks of 9/11. These policies are important to consider because they correlate with the increasing use of detention that subsequently drives the need for potential bonds. Even further, they impact the nature of bonds themselves. So in a bond hearing, the burden is on the non-citizen to demonstrate that they are not a danger to the community or a flight risk. Once national discourse and policy starts treating all immigrants as inherent risk to national security, we see a parallel response in the courts. First, this legislation lump together a series of criminal offenses that typically amount to simple misdemeanors and instead frame them as felonious under immigration law. Under this logic of protecting the community, anyone with a felonious offense is immediately excluded from a bond hearing and kept in mandatory detention. So we see a large majority of cases in our database without a criminal record, but that's because over the past decades, more and more non-citizens are cast as felonious criminals and are not even given the chance to seek a bond. What's more, studies show that immigrants overwhelmingly appear at immigration court hearings, and ICE check-ins and detention and harsh enforcement are not necessary to ensure compliance. In theory, the inflation of misdemeanors in the criminal justice system to aggravated felonies in the immigration system should mean that only, and I quote, the least risky immigrants are even eligible to seek bonds. But despite this, as our analysis showed, courts are setting increasingly expensive bonds for the non-citizens. The increasingly harsh enforcement policies from the turn of the century are not primarily impacting national security threats. They're increasing detention rates and the economic burdens for non-violent migrants and their families. To illustrate the economic burden that this is placing on detainees and their families, we can look at the relative cost of bonds and detention relative to the average annual salaries. So a Pew Research Center report estimated the annual family income for unauthorized immigrants in 2007 at $36,000. During the same year, the average bond amount granted was $7,680. In our set of cases for 2007, the average detention period for migrants was 75 days. This translates to a financial toll of $7,500 in unearned income over the days of detention. And together, these costs already total 42% of that family's estimated annual household income for the year. This estimate does not include additional costs, such as legal representation. Even if these cash-based sureties offer a path to potentially better circumstances than detention, they come at a financial toll that may similarly threaten their well-being and those of their families. And that's why legal representation becomes really crucial. Our analysis shows that beginning in the 2000s, but especially by 2001, criminal history stopped being a significant factor in the amount at which bond is set for non-citizens. Given the logic of, and I quote again, protecting communities, that is meant to influence bond assessments. So we should expect to see a relationship between criminal past and the determination of a bond. However, the shift in policy contexts means that all immigrants are seen as potential national security threats by default, getting more expensive bonds in turn. Thus, legal representation takes on more significance. It has always been true that in the setting of a bond, legal representation is impactful. But if criminal records are less relevant because everyone is considered a risk by default, immigration lawyers are key actors to support detained non-citizens in court, especially those with families facing economic distress, to avoid having to pay more expensive bonds, but also reaching out to community initiatives eager to support. Bail funds, for instance, in pro bono lawyers may offer potential hope for some of these detained immigrants and their families, but the economic and mental toll is steadily rising as we see the shift to detention rising and the paths out of it becoming more and more inaccessible. So from today's talk, I want you to take 3 key takeaways. Trends in bonds amounts are constraining and impoverishing immigrant communities that simply wish to solve their immigration cases. The increased stigma and the criminalization that migrants are experiencing is generally impacting case outcome, regardless of whether they have criminal history. Finally, ensuring legal representation and addressing cash-based sureties is more important than ever for escaping detention, but appears to not be a sustainable option for addressing the larger trends in immigration enforcement mechanisms being used in the 21st century. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Lorena, for your timely and really, really insightful research. I know the amount of data that you had to work through to come to get to your findings. So as Lorena work that you just have heard about demonstrates the shift to increase the criminalization embedded in immigration policies, especially following 9/11, has led to a huge increase in the use of detention as a response of the implementation of alternatives to detention. While the accessibility of bonds as a pathway out of detention is shrinking in many ways, as Lorena showed us, there has been a large expansion in the use of surveillance technologies by immigration enforcement to track non-citizens. In March 2023, we know that there were about 300,000 immigrants under ICE surveillance through electronic monitors for phone reporting or even smartphone apps. The usage of electronic monitors expanded even more during the Trump administration, and it remains high under Biden, with around 15,000 immigrants shackled as of December 2022 is the latest data that it's available at this time. These monitors, typically worn on the ankle, track and record the immigrants forced to wear them. But they are also highly visible, limit mobility, and are known to be highly prone to malfunction. Previous published research has examined how these surveillance devices can impact the well-being of the wearer, of the immigrant themselves. But as we have seen across the other presentations and the research overall from immigration, we know that impacts often spill over to immigrants' families as well as their communities. Our final presentation this afternoon in the East Coast, in this morning in the West Coast, the impact of immigration and customs enforcement surveillance technology on the well-being of children of immigrants from Dr. Miriam Martinez Aranda, a professor of sociology at the University of California, Irvine, examines the unintended impacts of these technologies on children and their potential harmful effects. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Dr. Vaquera, and thank you to everyone for being here today to listen to the findings of our research. My name is Miriam Martinez Aranda, and as Dr. Vaquera said, I am an assistant professor here at the University of California, Irvine. So related to Lorena's insights about the shifts in punishment and detention, my study looks critically at so-called alternative to detention. And as Dr. Aranda indicated, one of these alternatives is the use of electronic monitors as a condition of release from or avoidance of detention. And also much like Lorena described in her assessment of the policy shifts of the past few decades, this approach places freed immigrants under constant surveillance. But as all my colleagues have argued, the impact of this doesn't simply fall to a singular person, right? These potential negative impacts are what brought me to the research that I'm sharing with you all today. And the question for the study that I will talk about is how do these surveillance devices impact the lives of immigrants' families, particularly their children? So To assess this question, I spent 41 months conducting ethnographic research and interviewing 40 families impacted by electronic monitoring. So the study was conducted in the Los Angeles area, which has one of the highest numbers of individuals enrolled in the alternative to detention program, at approximately 4,000 participants. A figure, however, that has increased exponentially since I conducted this study. So during my ethnographic observations, I accompanied parents that were wearing these electronic monitors to their check-ins with the alternative to detention office, as well as to various events and daily activities, such as going to doctor appointments, grocery shopping, church, and even riding public transportation with them, and also going to accompany them to their school when they took their children. So during my, in addition to tracking, recording, mapping, and reporting on the wearer, electronic monitors have a very visible presence, right? Typically, they are attached to the ankle, and even it has an audible aspect, as they frequently malfunction, emitting loud noises. So I found through the participants' experience that the unreliable and invasive nature of this device put families at constant risk of separation through detention and deportation, and that it also disrupts their daily lives and relationships. So the process that I'm describing to you all today happens in two primary ways. So first, the electronic monitor impacts children's well-being by producing profound fear, stress, and shame, and by transferring the criminal stigma that is ascribed to the parents wearing the ankle monitor into the children. Second, the electronic monitor impacts children's relationships. What do I mean by this? So the electronic monitor is affecting the children's intimate relationship with the parents, and it's also shrinking the children's social circles. So in the following slides, I will show you, by using interview excerpts, how the electronic monitor impacts children's well-being and their relationship with their parents and community. This is the case of Leslie, and my grandmother from Guatemala, who told me friends wouldn't return my calls after they saw me with this electronic monitor. They think that because I have this, I have some problems with the police. My daughter texted their daughter, and she said that they are afraid of ICE because they also don't have papers. So the presence of the electronic monitor impacts children's social circles, especially during periods of heightened anti-immigrant sentiment. Community members might avoid contact with individuals wearing the electronic monitor, either because of their own stress or because they fear their tenuous status could put them in danger. So as we saw with Lorena's exploration of bail bonds, the increasing focus on criminalization means that it doesn't matter if there is no history of criminal record beyond the immigration issue itself. So similarly, I find that the disruption of community ties from the visual stigma of monitors has a profound impact on children's mental health. There is trauma, shame, fear, and isolation that is produced by this electronic monitor. Here we have the case of Rita, a Mexican immigrant and mother of two, who exemplifies, right, how the threat and malfunctioning of the technology affects her children, who are both US citizens. Rita told me during our interview, "It breaks me to see them scared when the electronic monitor make noises. I talk to them, hold them, and tell them everything will be fine. What else can I do? They cry anyways. The oldest is constantly asking me if I'm going to leave them again." We all know that child-parent separation is very traumatic. However, when the electronic monitor puts children in this traumatic situation repeatedly, every time it malfunctions, it has grave implications for the well-being of an entire generation of children living with a technology that threatens their parents' deportation, a threat that for the children is tangible, is a threat that is constant, and is a threat that is visually present. In addition to fear, older children who were more aware of the meaning of the electronic monitor expressed shame and anger around the stigma produced by this device. For instance, here we have the case of Domenico, a father from Guatemala, who shared his experience about his teenage children, David and Gemma. Soon after Domenico was released from immigration detention, he was shackled to an electronic monitor, and the family tried to visit an amusement park to celebrate Domenico's release from detention. But Domenico was pulled to the side because the electronic monitor started beeping. So Domenico shared with me and explains what happened during that time. People look at you like you're a criminal. And you know, I can deal with it. But it hits differently when they do it in front of your kids. It is as if I failed them. We went to the park and security put me to the side because they wanted to look at it. And everyone stared at us. They were ashamed. This situation affects them. My son is always angry and he wasn't like that. So the family experienced this electronic monitor as a source of stigmatization and shame, right? Because the electronic monitor frames immigrants as criminals in the eyes of others. And although Domenico states that he can handle people's judgment, he indicates that it is difficult to see his children endure this criminal stigma. So the use of electronic monitors on immigrant parents significantly impacts the mental health, the material and relational well-being of their children, including US citizen children. So this surveillance and the looming threat of deportation erodes the children's sense of belonging as they observe their parents' exclusion and criminalization. And additionally, such experiences may lead children to become wary of institutions, potentially foregoing educational, political, and economic opportunities. So the implications of this research, right, is that ICE Electronic Monitors program, they operate under this, the guise of providing a quote unquote humane alternative to detention, when in reality, it extends the harm of immigration enforcement to children. There are approximately 6 million children under 18 who live with an undocumented parent in the United States, and many of them are citizen children, right? And then finally, the implications for the well-being of communities now, right? But also huge implications for the development of children, right? Including US citizen children. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez Aranda, and thank you to all of our fellows for sharing their incredible work with us today. I'm inspired by the work of this group because their findings and their insights show what those of us who have personal and professional experiences with the immigration system deeply know, that despite attempts to cast immigrants as not belonging in this country, their experiences are deeply connected to all of us. The work shared today only scratches the surface of the realities we are seeing across the country. Today's presentations from Arizona and California resonate with findings we see from research, including my own work with Dr. Vaquera in Florida that showed immigrant young adults' mental health often responds to policy changes in the immigration system, deteriorating when policies and programs curtail their rights. Other colleagues in our networks are studying these damaging effects across the country, both at the border and far beyond in places like Maryland and Missouri. As researchers, we believe that it's a crucial moment to elevate these realities so that we can respond to them. This means responding to the violence of enforcement-first crimmigration measures and recognizing how they damage the mental and physical well-being of immigrants, especially at the border. And it means we must recognize that these same measures affect communities, including U.S. citizens, and especially citizens of color. Even further, they're impacting new generations, the young children of immigrants. Our current immigration enforcement practices at the border and beyond pose a human rights crisis and pose the threat of long-term emotional, educational, occupational, and civic engagement outcomes that will impact all of us if we don't address them now.
Building on that, just a reminder that to make policies that proactively account for and respond to these realities, we need rich and systematically collected empirical data that considers immigrants and that recognizes well-being as a powerful aspect of our lives. We also need for that research to be used by decision makers. It has to make it to places like Capitol Hill and the community organizations doing on-the-ground work. In that spirit, we hope that you will continue to engage with the collaborative after today's briefing. We believe in our namesake that collaborative work is the most effective approach to solve problems and reduce inequalities, and we are eager to connect and share evidence or co-design projects that can better immigrant lives. You can find information on the collaborative's members and their work via our website, iwbcollab.org. There you will also find opportunities like trainings and ways to connect. To follow up on any questions about today's briefing, or if you are interested in meeting with a member of the collaborative, you can also reach out to us at admin@iwbcollab.org. Thank you sincerely for joining us today. And a big thank you to the entire collaborative team for all the work behind the scenes that they do and making today's webinar possible. In collaboration, I wish you all a good weekend. Bye-bye.